Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Israeli government spokesman Eylon Levy. This is day 129 of the October 7th war. IDF fatalities since the start of the October 7th massacre have risen to 566. That's up by 4 since our last update. The people of Israel grieve with the families of Major David Shakuri, 30, Staff Sergeant Hanan Drori, 26, Sergeant First Class Reserves Alon Kleinman, 21, and Sergeant First Class Adi Eldor, 21. We salute them all for their heroism. An update on the October 7th hostage crisis. In a daring rescue operation deep in Rafah overnight, Israel successfully rescued 2 hostages, Luis Ha and Fernando Marman, both abducted by Hamas death squads from kibbutz Nir Yitzhak on October 7th. In a complex rescue mission under fire, the IDF, Israel Police and Shin Bet conducted a targeted raid in the heart of Rafah with aerial coverage to rescue the 2 hostages. In the early morning at 1:49 a.m., Special Forces breached a civilian building in Rafah and found the 2 hostages who were being helmed by armed terrorists in an apartment on the 2nd floor. 1 minute after the building was breached, the Air Force and Southern Command activated aerial fire to enable the forces' disengagement and strike Hamas terrorists in the area. Yamam officers from the Israel Police Special Forces shielded the 2 hostages with their bodies until they could be extracted under fire, accompanied by IDF forces. Following an initial medical examination by army doctors, the hostages were airlifted by helicopter for medical treatment at the Sheba Medical Center near Tel Aviv, where they were reunited with their families. Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant arrived at the command center overnight and accompanied the tense operation. Following the successful rescue mission, the Prime Minister reaffirmed our consistent policy that only continued military pressure until total victory will bring about the release of all our hostages. The Prime Minister reiterated we will not miss any opportunity to bring them home. That's 2 more hostages home and 134 still to go. Israel remains committed to the pledge that there will be no one left behind. We will continue applying military pressure to release the hostages by force where possible and to create the conditions for their release otherwise. An important update on the hostage figures following last night's successful rescue mission. On October 7th, Hamas abducted 253 people, adding to the 4 it was holding from before the war. There is still 1 missing person who is unaccounted for from the October 7 massacre. With last night's rescue mission, 112 hostages have now been extracted alive from the Gaza Strip, most in the context of the last hostage release pause in late November. In addition, IDF forces have recovered the bodies of 8 hostages murdered in captivity, and of course the 3 hostages tragically and erroneously killed by our forces. That still leaves 134 hostages still trapped in the Hamas terror dungeons, at least 31 of whom are dead, and 103 we must presume to be alive, including women and children. The State of Israel remains committed to the pledge. There will be no one left behind, and we will continue fighting to bring all of them home, the women and the men, the children and the elderly, civilians and soldiers. There will be no ceasefire that leaves the Hamas terror regime in power or the hostages in Gaza. Now, an important update about the situation in Rafah, in the southern Gaza Strip. We wish to make an urgent appeal to the international community. It is time for you to help protect civilians in Gaza from the Hamas terrorists who are trying to use them as human shields. Since the start of this war that Hamas launched, Israel has employed extensive measures to protect civilians in Gaza from their own leaders' evil attempts to keep them in the line of fire. From millions of warnings to humanitarian corridors secured by our forces to targeted raids that put our men in harm's way, those measures have brought the civilian to combatant ratio in Gaza down to around 1-to-1, unprecedented in the history of warfare. At every turn, however, we have been stymied by UN agencies, more concerned with pressuring Israel to end the war with Hamas still standing than to protect civilians. They have resisted our efforts to vacate civilians from Hamas strongholds, libelously characterizing those measures in pursuance of our obligations under international law as forced displacement. They share immense culpability for the tragic loss of life that could have been avoided if the world had worked with us to thwart the Hamas human shield strategy. In covering up Hamas's militarization of hospitals and its military assets inside UN facilities, including that server farm and intelligence hub located literally underneath UNRWA's headquarters in Gaza. International officials have been telling Israel to give immunity to Hamas targets. In telling Israel not to attack because civilians will be hurt, but then resisting efforts to get civilians out of harm's way, they have rendered themselves complicit with Hamas's human shield strategy and told it that that strategy works and to keep going. The United Nations and international actors now face a fateful choice. Do they want to save Hamas or save Palestinian civilians? They cannot stop Israel from dismantling the last 4 Hamas battalions in the Gaza Strip and securing the release of the 134 remaining hostages after the October 7 massacre. But the decisions they make now can still protect civilians from the war that Hamas has brought on them. The Prime Minister has instructed the Israel Defense Forces to present a plan for the evacuation of civilians from Rafah because we do not want to see civilians being hurt. And we still have excess capacity at Israeli crossings to more than double the amount of food, water, medicine and shelter equipment entering Gaza. We urge UN agencies to cooperate with Israel's efforts to protect civilians from Hamas and evacuate them from a war zone where terrorists are trying to use them as human shields. Don't say it can't be done. Work with us to find a way. It is beyond regrettable that instead of cooperating with Israel's efforts since Hamas launched this war, UN agencies have been funneling civilians into Hamas strongholds and playing along and validating the Hamas human shield strategy. That must stop. Yesterday, the Prime Minister spoke with our friend and ally, President Biden. We welcome the statement from the White House that the United States shares our goal to see Hamas defeated and to ensure long-term security for Israel and its people. The war that Hamas started with the October 7th massacre will continue until we have achieved all 3 of our goals: destroying Hamas, releasing all the hostages, and ensuring that Gaza never again pose a threat to the people of Israel. This war can come to a swift conclusion, with no more suffering, if Hamas surrenders immediately, lays down its arms, releases the hostages, and hands over its war criminals for a tribunal. And all actors interested in protecting civilian lives and improving humanitarian conditions in the Gaza Strip must demand that Hamas surrender now, instead of lobbying to keep Hamas's last 4 battalions on their feet in the face of an impending Israeli victory to restore security for our people in the wake of the bloodiest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It's the end of today's update. We'll now take any questions you have. Thank you.
The first question comes from Hannah Julian of the Jewish Press. Palestinian Authority leader Mahmoud Abbas is reportedly trying to put together a soft core government with Hamas in cooperation with international leaders for the day after the war in Gaza. Do you have a comment on that?
Hannah, I haven't heard those specific reports. We believe that whoever governs Gaza, in fact, whoever is governing the Palestinian population in the West Bank, must be committed to fighting terrorism, not funding it. They must be committed to routing Hamas, not rooting for it. It is regrettable that the Palestinian Authority has yet to condemn the October 7 massacre, and that instead of being committed to fighting Hamas and the poisonous ideology that it represents, it claims that Hamas is an organic part of the Palestinian fabric. That shows us the deep, deep extremism problem that we have, that we are dealing with, and we hope that the day after Hamas, the day after that terrorist regime is consigned to the dustbin of history, the Palestinian people will turn a new leaf and be committed to living alongside us in peace and security, instead of continuing their failed strategy from the past 100 years of trying to eliminate any sovereign Jewish presence in this land.
Second question from Hannah Julian. A Dutch court has issued an order to block all exports to Israel of US-owned F-35 stealth fighter jet parts within 7 days. What is Israel's response to this decision, and will it impact Israel's ability to defend itself from Hamas, Hezbollah, and other enemies on its borders?
I'm not familiar with this particular report. Needless to say, we expect our allies to stand firmly by our side as we fight to bring Hamas to justice in the wake of the October 7 massacre. We are fighting for humanity, on the front lines of humanity, and only a resounding defeat of the terrorist machine that perpetrated the October 7 massacre will prevent that extremism and terrorism from spiraling further in Europe. I'll note that Israel has already worked with foreign intelligence agencies to thwart Hamas sleeper cells and attempts to perpetrate attacks on Western targets, and that should be front of everyone's minds in Europe at the moment.
Question from Life on the Border. How is Israel responding to Egyptian threats to abrogate the peace treaty if Israel enters the Philadelphia corridor and its move to deploy tanks and anti-aircraft radar to its side of the border?
We are, of course, in continuous contact with our neighbors in Egypt. Our position since October 7 remains unchanged. We are fighting to destroy the Hamas military and governing infrastructure inside the Gaza Strip. Nowhere in Gaza will be immune for the perpetrators of the October 7 massacre. We are now approaching a ground offensive in Rafah because Israeli forces have already successfully swept through most of the Gaza Strip from the north. Hamas started this war with 24 battalions. 18 of those have now been shattered. 2 are on their last legs in Khan Yunis, and that leaves 4 inside Rafah. We're talking about 3/4 of Hamas's battalions that have been shattered, therefore, with over 12,000 terrorists who have been killed. When you take into account the number of terrorists who have been wounded or apprehended, that is more than half of Hamas's fighting force knocked out of action. And we are determined to continue with that strategy of dismantling the Hamas military machine. And as the Prime Minister said, it would be absurd to stop at this point, just as when the 86-nation international coalition was fighting ISIS, it would have been absurd to leave 1/4 of the Islamic State army in power to use that territory from which to regroup and perpetrate barbaric atrocities against people around the world. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thank you very much, everyone, and do keep safe. Thank you.